am.
Okay, so first of all, let me welcome all of our guests tonight to the last webinar that's sponsored by the Villanova University Task Force on the Sexual Abuse Crisis in the Catholic Church. My name is Mark Graham. I'm a faculty member in the Theology and Religious Studies Department. So I'm going to do a brief bio of Janet, and then we're going to get into her talk. Janet Heimlich is an award-winning journalist and the author of Breaking Their Will, Shedding Light on Religious Child Maltreatment, the first book to fully examine the issue of child abuse and neglect enabled by religious belief. Bishop John Shelby Spong described her book as insightful, provocative, and exposing, and novelist Anne Rice called it well-researched and well-written. In 2012, Janet founded the Child Friendly Faith Project, the mission of which is to share knowledge and to build community around the issue of religious child maltreatment, and to advocate for and to empower those whose lives are impacted by religious child maltreatment. Prior to becoming a child advocate, Janet was an award-winning freelance reporter for National Public Radio. She graduated from Stanford University with a BA in communications and a minor in English. Janet lives in Austin, Texas, with her not-so-sassy teenage daughter. Janet, it's a pleasure to have you here tonight. Thanks so much for joining us.
Oh, you're most welcome. Thank you so much for having me. And I really appreciate all the folks that are attending and who will be watching this in the future, because it shows that you care. And I hope that I'm able to reveal some information that's new to you. You know, that's my main goal. And I want to be available to any questions that you might have at the end during the Q&A. So I'm just going to start by sharing my screen and getting going. So my talk is about what happens in religious organizations and communities where they are faced with cases of child sexual abuse. But the real focus that I want to spend time on tonight is more of the front end. A lot of people are familiar with cases that they've heard about in small and large faith organizations where cases of child sexual abuse are covered up or rushed through or somehow quashed in some way. What is less discussed are the kinds of religious teachings and policies and doctrines that actually enable this type of maltreatment to occur. And I want to be clear that a lot of what you'll be hearing from me are the same kinds of issues that we have heard about in secular organizations. But when we're talking about religious organizations, there are certain aspects of this type of crime that manifest themselves in a special way. So if we're just talking about child sexual abuse, in general, you're probably familiar with the fact that these cases often involve a power imbalance between the abuser and the victim. Violations can include grooming, inappropriate touching, sexual contact, exposing children to pornography, recording sexual acts, and so forth. It's really important when suspected cases rise to the surface that they get reported. And remember that you don't need to have absolute proof that a crime has taken place. There just needs to be a suspicion based on information that one has received. It's really critical for these cases to be reported soon so that victims get the proper support that they need, that they are removed from a dangerous environment, or excuse me, the perpetrators are removed from a dangerous environment, and the perpetrators are held accountable. And of course, there are many different types of trauma that victims and adult survivors experience, from physical injury to feelings of shame, anger, and suicidal ideation. And when we talk about child sexual abuse in a religious context, we still have that power imbalance I mentioned. But when you have a situation where a religious authority is a perpetrator, then you really can see a very huge power imbalance, depending on what kind of community or organization we're talking about. And I want to mention too that in a lot of religious communities, the religious authority isn't necessarily someone who is ordained by a large organization. It could be, for example, the father of a household who is given more power than, say, the women in the household, due to the doctrines that they subscribe to. Violations include the types of things that I talked about earlier, but we add into that there are religious teachings that actually can sometimes condone, enable, or justify child sexual abuse. And sometimes we will see cases where perpetrators will use religious messaging to victimize, and even members of the community will use religious messaging to silence victims. When there is an improper response, perhaps a delayed response or no response at all, the motivation can be to protect the reputation of the faith or religious organization, or perhaps religious leader as perpetrator. Victims can be denied support, and perpetrators are not held accountable in certain communities where they are authoritarian, and we're going to get into what that means a little bit later. And finally, in addition to the forms of trauma that I mentioned, uh, these victims will also sometimes experience spiritual trauma, where whatever comfort they may have felt from their faith or trust they had in religious leaders uh, could just be snatched out from under them. And I have some quotes I actually wanted to read to you from researchers and survivors. Reverend Dr. Theda Franz, who's a psychotherapist, wrote about this type of trauma when she wrote, "God begins to be associated with the experience of molestation and can keep the victim from seeking out spiritual help later in life." Carla, a survivor I spoke with, said to me that I grew up feeling like I had an inside, behind the scenes view of reality, seeing my stepfather, who was her abuser, allied with my minister and all the other muckety mucks in my church, made me think church is corrupt, that it is not a place you can trust or believe in. And another survivor wrote, "My ability to pray and believe that there's a God listening was impacted by the abuse. I don't trust that anymore, so I have a problem from that very basic sort of spiritual level that you need to be able to connect with God." I think we're just going to jump right into religious beliefs that are problematic, starting with the idea that religious leaders are superhuman. A lot of children are raised with this idea from birth, and many parents are taught this and carry with them this same kind of belief, which can really negatively impact children if they are victims of sexual abuse. So parents and children can be taught to believe that religious authorities are godly, perfect, infallible, and many congregants will just blindly trust or worship or fear religious authorities. So you can see what kind of issues can result if religious authorities are abusers. You have parents allowing children to spend time with religious leaders one-on-one without any vetting because of this uh, belief in these individuals being somehow beyond reproach. And when religious authorities do abuse, victims are confused, defenseless, and extremely vulnerable. They can also be highly resistant to reporting. And finally, when some do come forward, victims cannot be believed, they can be punished, and even blamed for the abuse. Betty Bottoms is a researcher at the University of Illinois at Chicago, who wrote, because religious leaders are thought to be moral or holy, their sexual advances are likely to be particularly confusing, guilt-inducing betrayals for victims. Laura Jessup is an abuse survivor from the FLDS. It's a organization we'll be talking about a little bit later. And what she wrote in her book, her memoir, was taking my clothes off and getting naked with my father, who was considered to be in that community a religious leader, or high priest, as they call those individuals, was not only extremely humiliating, it was damning. So, belief number two, that children are sinful, perhaps born into sin, and it is critical for their salvation that they be somehow pure. You can see a lot of issues resulting from this, even if they don't end in sexual abuse. Girls who don't who are not compliant with certain rules of the organization can be labeled as Jezebels, or violators of having dishonored their faith community or their family. Children who are just thinking about sexual acts, considering uh, seeing say material images online of two people engaging in intimacy, perhaps they have started masturbating, can be made to feel unworthy. They and develop all kinds of internalized guilt and shame, and this really impacts their ability to deal with abuse if it should occur. It also makes them more vulnerable to abuse. Children who are LGBTQ have a particularly difficult time with this type of belief about children needing to be pure, because in many authoritarian faith communities, they are made to feel absolutely unworthy, and just being who they are. And so, we do see a lot of issues with that, with children who are LGBTQ and gay and transgender, etc. In a lot of communities, kids are just not taught about sexuality or sexual health or abuse. That also leaves them very vulnerable. And finally, because of this belief that we're talking about, this ideology, victims can be blamed for abuse and even be shunned and punished. This is a survivor of the Southern Baptist Purity movement. I don't think that she's a sexual abuse survivor, but this just kind of gets across how emotional health is impacted by this type of extremist belief. And she writes, I would find myself in tears and in a ball in the corner of a bed crying, my eczema coming out, which it does when I'm stressed, and scratching myself till I bled and having a deep shame reaction. We went to war with ourselves, our own bodies, and our own sexual natures, all under the strict commandment of the church. Brent Jeffs is also an abuse survivor of the FLDS, as Flora Jessup was, and he was abused by the leader of the FLDS. His name is Warren Jeffs. And he wrote in his book, I felt like I must have been a bad person for this to have happened to me, like it was some kind of punishment. I'd been told by my abuser that it was what God wanted, so I must have done something terrible. Why would God do that to a good boy? I felt like it was all my fault, that I should have done something to stop it. I felt filthy and disgusting and repulsive. I couldn't even explain it to myself, let alone tell an adult. My abuser had so much power in the church. This belief that we should forgive all sinners is just taken to a real extreme when faith communities insist that child victims of sexual abuse should forgive their sinners. But that is what is emphasized at times. You may be familiar with Amish communities that have a very strong emphasis on forgiveness. And a lot of Christian-based communities that do focus on this um, will refer to passages in the Bible that speak to the importance of forgiveness. And forgiveness can be a very healthy thing for an adult to do to help them deal with trauma. But when it's extrapolated to the point where child victims of abuse are told this, it really ends up more serving the community as a way to avoid the issue. And remember that religious organizations very often they're in the business of converting sinners, and they want to grow their community. They don't want the last thing they want to do is excommunicate people, even who have done atrocious things. That's really a last resort. So when you have this kind of mindset, victims can be denied mental health care and safety from their perpetrators. Uh, Instead of removing perpetrators from a dangerous situation, victims can have to be in their presence and not be receiving any type of mental health support. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some doctrines uh, that, as strange as it might sound, actually have promoted adult child sex. Um, but what I want to start with is the fact that the acceptance of adults having sex with underage children has been going on a long time, both in secular society and in ancient times, where as long as it was happening in marriage or was something that could kind of be forced into marriage, it was not seen as a crime. The Talmud, the ancient Jewish text on Jewish law, speaks to this in a number of passages, and this is one of them. A maiden aged 3 years and 1 day may be acquired in marriage by coition. Coition means intercourse. In the Bible, Deuteronomy uh, talks about what kind of penalty there should be uh, when a man's daughter is raped if she is a virgin. And because at that time children were seen as property, the violation was not seen as being something against the victim, but against the father, the possessor. As long as the rapist would pay the father a significant amount of money and marry the girl and stay married, then all was forgiven. Early Christian canon law set minimum age of marriage at puberty, which was set at that time as 12 for females, 14 for males. Catholic popes ruled that intercourse with girls, quote, had the effect of sealing a marriage contract as long as such intercourse took place after the age of discretion, which is 7. Parents continued to arrange marriages for prepubescent children into the Middle Ages. It still goes on to this day. And in 1918, the Catholic Church raised the age of consent to 14 for girls and 16 for boys. This particular group, called the Children of God, sprouted among many cults in the 1960s, and it was started by a man named David Berg, who developed what he called his law of love. It was a doctrine that mixed Christian beliefs with sexuality. He went into hiding soon after this happened, but he still was able to control the group. That's kind of common with cult experts. They go into hiding and then they become this enigma, and everyone thinks that whatever they say is godly. Sexual acts were encouraged between children and adults, particularly those who were close to David Berg's inner circle. And survivors have talked about being sexualized as children, participating in orgies and so forth. As one survivor said, the sex acts were performed, quote, in love and were, quote, sanctioned in the eyes of God. The current organization, now called Family, is run by Berg's widow. He's been dead for a long time. And she has acknowledged that members were harmed, but to this day, no perpetrators have served justice. The FLDS is a second group I'm going to talk about, where religious doctrines actually have contributed to adult child sex. There are about 10,000 members of this group, which is the Fundamentalist Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. So they consider themselves the original LDS church, and that the mainstream church kind of broke off from them. But some of their beliefs is still rooted in LDS doctrines, specifically in a book called The Doctrine and Covenants. And these doctrines talk about polygamy being necessary for mainly men to reach the celestial kingdom in the afterlife. And these doctrines also talk about condoning men marrying many virgins. So what you'll find is polygamous relationships where with each marriage, the girls get younger and younger and younger. Warren Jeffs, who was Brent Jeffs' abuser, married some 80 wives, and some of them were as young as 12 and 13, 14. He's now serving a life sentence in a Texas prison for raping 2 girls in the church as part of a religious ritual. And there were women who presided over these rituals. They had audio tapes of the rapes, which were played at his trial. And then this is part of a raid in Texas when they moved their group down there. There were many other men that were also incarcerated. I wanted to talk a little bit about what I call religious authoritarian cultures. It is important to understand that if we're trying to determine when children are particularly vulnerable to religious maltreatment, whether it be emotional abuse, sexual abuse, neglect, and so forth, I have found in my research that the worst problems seem to always happen in these authoritarian cultures. And what I mean by authoritarian is the governance style of the culture. And I can talk later if you're interested in just kind of what identifies an authoritarian culture. My book goes into that in some detail. But just some of the telltale signs and issues that come out of these organizations are the following, and it can take on different degrees. So it's not either, an organization is authoritarian or it's not. It's kind of like, the more it reaches out to the authoritarian end of the spectrum, the more problems that we're going to see. So one trait is that the needs of the collective take priority over the needs of individuals. Parents fail as children's chief protectors because they're also kind of dragged into some of these authoritarian systems, and they become what researchers call middle manager parents. And oftentimes they're very conflicted based on the strict rules of the group that they feel they have to follow, and at the same time they can feel very concerned about what's happening to their kids. So oftentimes parents are caught in the middle. Cases of child sexual abuse, when they are made known, oftentimes are, quote, prosecuted or investigated internally and not reported to outsiders. These cases are usually overseen by male religious leaders who have no training in forensics or sexual abuse or child psychology. That can be very problematic. There's a resistance to report based on fears and mistrust of governmental organizations, those on the outside. And sometimes when individuals do report a crime, including the victims themselves, they can be punished, such as by being shunned or excommunicated. And when cases do get reported to, say, CPS or law enforcement, oftentimes they're really hard to investigate, much less prosecute, because evidence has been lost or victims are too afraid to come forward. When it comes to the Catholic Church, I think that the biggest issue that works against victims and children in that organization is its insistence on secrecy, and this has gone on for centuries, where they have tracked cases of child sexual abuse. Didn't call it that until fairly recently, but these cases would be locked away, and uh, and it was not to be spoken of. It was very important to the church that outsiders don't find out about these cases, and the church has long preferred to handle it internally. It is loosening a grip on that, and we'll talk about that in a second. Um, but these cases were in a 1962 church document, articulated to be restrained by perpetual silence, where perpetrators could be removed from their ministry, but they could also be transferred to another assignment. And so that was something that was stated in 1962. 2001, a letter that was co-written by the then Cardinal Ratzinger, who oversaw the office that determines doctrines for the church. He made it clear that cases of child sexual abuse should be reserved to the apostolic tribunal, so handled internally, and subject to the pontifical secret, which is a very severe dictum that no one in the church would ever want to violate. In 2019, Pope Francis required church officials to report perpetrators and those who cover up cases, but only to their superiors. So again, it's still keeping it internal. And then finally, recently, the Vatican advised bishops to report cases to law enforcement, but did not require it. The church continues to fight lawsuits and quash laws requiring that clergy report allegations of abuse and confession. So, and other bills that really would help victims. Jehovah's Witnesses is a very large worldwide organization. However, its communities, even if they're located in cities, are operated in a separatist way. It's a highly legalistic organization, and I could give you many examples of that and how they work against children. But for today, I just wanted to address what's known as the two witness rule. As I said, it's a legalistic organization, and so when it comes to say Deuteronomy 19:15, that requires that someone who is accused of a crime, they must produce at least two witnesses. Jehovah's Witnesses has had this passage apply to cases of child sexual abuse, and of course, these cases rarely have any witnesses outside of the perpetrator and victim. So while Jehovah's Witnesses organization called the Watchtower has claimed that child sexual abuse is very rare in the organization, if you have something like the two witness rule, you can see why that would be, or appear that it is rare. And to this day, the organization has not formally ended the two witness rule. In Orthodox Jewish communities, particularly the more strict Hasidic or Haredi communities, we have seen many leaders work against child victims and essentially protect perpetrators. Some of the or one doctrine that I'm going to mention, called Masira, has to do with forbidding Jews to report a fellow Jew to outside authorities. And there are some other Jewish doctrines that have to do with not talking badly about a fellow Jew. Well, that has been applied to cases of child sexual abuse. So if there is a perpetrator in the community, it will get hushed up. It will not be spoken about outside the community. It will not be reported. And instead, these cases are handled through a very structured type of process, their internal court system called the Violating. In 2011, the governing body of Herediges ruled that one must consult a rabbi before reporting cases to outside authorities. So you're seeing just the same kind of theme here of we want to protect the collective at all costs, even if it involves child victims of sexual abuse. Now, if the abuser is outside the organization, that would likely be handled a little bit better. But if the perpetrator is inside, then child victims oftentimes are not given the support that they need. They're not given mental health services. And as I've said, perpetrators are not reported and made to be accountable. So I just wanted to talk about the importance of education based on what you've been hearing, and then I'll turn it over to questions. Education is the key when it comes to trying to shift people's views from a very insular, fear-based type of outlook to one that is more focused on child protection. So I feel it's really important for parents to identify the different aspects of religious authoritarianism. In my book, I actually have several pages where I just list a whole bunch of questions specifically for parents to help them identify if they're in a religious authoritarian culture. Sometimes you can't really recognize it if you're in the middle of it. Adults need to talk to children about sexual health and abuse as age appropriate. They should also be discussing sexual orientation and gender identity, gender dysphoria, and those kind of issues. We need to give these things oxygen and not turn it into something that leads to children internalizing all kinds of unhealthy emotions and making them more vulnerable to abuse. I think it's really important for religious organizations to partner with child abuse advocacy groups so that they can learn about how to develop effective prevention policies and procedures, and also learn about the law regarding mandatory reporting. Religious leaders and staff, anyone who interacts with children should receive training on abuse and these laws. And finally, I've discussed, some religious teachings that have really negatively impacted the lives of children. I feel that if more religious organizations would partner with child development experts, have their curriculum for parents and children vetted by child psychologists or organizations that are more than happy to review this kind of material, then they would have a better handle on how they are instructing parents and families about the faith. And I will say that my nonprofit, we actually developed a curriculum that religious organizations can use totally behind closed doors to learn about this sort of thing. And hopefully we'll see more making use of that. So at that point, I think I will stop sharing and see if anyone has something that like to share or ask or argue with.
Thanks for the fine presentation, Janet. I appreciate it. It's very insightful and very educational for me. So if anybody has a question, please feel free to type it in the chat section, and I'll go ahead and read those questions or comments off to Janet, and she can respond. Janet, as they start coming in, I had this lurking suspicion. So I'm a cradle Catholic, right? And sometimes a little bit of a begrudging Catholic for a number of different reasons. But anyway, I'm still part of the fold, right? And as you were talking about religious authoritarianism, I kept asking myself, you know what, am I part of a religiously authoritarian community? And so near the end of your presentation, when you start talking about the signs of religious authoritarianism, right? Could you list like the top 3 or 5 off the top of your head for me?
I'd be happy to, and I'm going to actually share my screen again because I was anticipating that question, and so and I usually kind of feel like, oh, this is people don't want to get into that. I'll just have it in my back pocket. So here it is. Here's my back pocket. Um, there are 3 components that I feel speak the loudest in terms of identifying religious authoritarian cultures. And I want to say too that when it comes to really huge organizations such as the Catholic Church, which is kind of everywhere, and it can't be centralized in the same way as some other smaller organizations are. So I use the word culture because I'm looking really at the immediate environment of families. That I think is more indicative to determine whether children are at risk or not. So the first is that these cultures have a rigid hierarchical social structure. And that means that religious leaders have usually a lot more power than anyone else. Men almost always have significantly more power than women. Women are denied being leaders in the church. And I talked before about parents being middle managers. So they're kind of, sometimes caught in between. Children are almost powerless. They're given very little autonomy, and usually it's based on really rigid rules as opposed to uh, based on their individual needs or what child development experts would determine is best for them. And instead, it's more of a cookie cutter approach to child rearing. The culture is often fearful and uh, suffers punitive measures for those that are non-compliant. So obedience is strongly emphasized. The rules are very clear, and there are certain beliefs that it's just black or white. This is what we're about. You're kind of in or you're out. And those that don't really embrace the ideologies or don't do well with a really strict infrastructure can suffer a lot in these communities, whether they're children who are considered to be sinful or misbehaving, whether it's a teenage girl who's caught talking to a boy that's it's where that might not be permitted, um, or it could be, say, a LGBTQ youth who has found something online, that they feel really speaks to them, and then they're caught and can be punished. Thirdly, the culture is separatist, and I mentioned before about Jehovah's Witnesses. They are a socially separatist group. Now, the FLDS, they are a geographically separatist group where they actually set up, in their compounds very far from uh, other cultures or towns or cities. But the separatist aspect of it can still be there, even if they're in an urban environment. And that's where you get those issues where crimes against children are not reported. There are feelings of mistrust, fear of persecution, um, looking down upon outsiders as apostates. And so there's this really big separation there that members are made to believe. and that can really work against children who are victims of any form of abuse, because outside authorities such as child protective services or law enforcement just don't don't find out about the cases. Is that helpful, Mark?
Yes, thank you. I was. Appreciate that. Janet, we've got a couple questions that have come in. So the first one is, how did you get into researching a topic like this?
Well, thank you for asking that. Um, my background is as a journalist. Um, I am not a survivor of religious child maltreatment. I did notice as a kid when I would be taken to, say, a synagogue, because I was born into a Jewish family. My parents were very much sort of cultural Jews, and we didn't even really talk about religious anything in our family. But we had friends, that family friends, that would take my sister and me to various uh, Jewish uh, types of celebrations, or we would go to celebrate Passover, for example. And there were things said in there that really shocked me as a child, and the way that the story of Passover was told. I mean, seemed really violent, and killing the firstborn of every family. I mean, that's pretty rough stuff for children to hear. But no, so I'm not. I'm not a survivor of that. But I did become a journalist and started to. I think I was starting just to talk to people I knew I had known for a long time, and found out that they were raised in kind of extremist religious environments. Uh, I had no idea that these people had suffered with that as children, and that kind of the more extreme the religious culture was, definitely the abuse was worse. And I don't want to leave out neglect. I call it religious child maltreatment to include both abuse and neglect. Neglect can be extremely dangerous. After that, I think I was just then driven to try to understand this phenomenon more and more, researching cases. I mean, at the time, there were a lot more cases that were making big headlines than we're seeing now. Now, I hate to say that perhaps that's because of COVID, but I also like to think that there is more awareness, perhaps partly from the work of our nonprofit, the Child Friendly Faith Project. But at that time, I mean, there were some horrendous cases. I've gotten to know perpetrators who were responsible for their own children's death due to the religious teachings of their environment. Um, and these are real tragedies that I write about, and I wanted to understand this better. So I did. There are some parents who have been perpetrators that then really regretted their actions and kind of got out of that authoritarian environment and want to be an advocate. So I learned a lot from them. So no, my background is just as a journalist, and I got into it as a journalist, and then just stuck with it because I became an advocate.
Janet, the next question: how hard emotionally or mentally was it to research this topic?
Well, thank you for asking. I don't want to be like the subject of this, because I want the issues are what's really important, and supporting survivors and so forth. But um, it 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 was extremely difficult. Um, I remember interviewing a formerly Amish man who was raised with such horrendous abuse, um, as many children who were raised in the more conservative Amish cultures have been. I mean, severe abuse in those communities. And I mean, I just live with his story to this day. Um, I always want to thank people who read my book because it's also not an easy read. But I guess when I was just feeling, you know, just overwhelmed by some of these cases, I would just think this is nothing compared to it the victims experienced and adult survivors carry with them every day. Um, so so it's a really tough issue. It's a really tough issue, and my book deals with all forms of religious child maltreatment, not just sexual abuse.
Janet, another question. Have you watched any documentaries on Netflix or Hulu about these crimes? And secondly, do you recommend any documentaries or resources to learn more about these crimes?
Wow, that's a really good question. And we are keeping up with our resources. If you go to childfriendlyfaith.org, we do put videos in there. I I haven't been keeping up with a lot of them in terms of watching them because sometimes I just want to give myself a bit of a break from the issue. But I do track some of these, and I have seen some excellent dramas and documentaries that relate to the Hasidic Jewish community. And I'm sorry, I'm not remembering the names. If anyone knows it, just shout it out. But it's this amazing drama, an episodic drama of this uh, girl at the age of 18 or 19 escapes from her Orthodox Jewish community. And I mean, it's just fascinating. There's another one on that's similar called Shtetl, I think is the name of it. But if you Google that topic, you're going to find it. And then you may have heard of Leah Remini, if I'm saying your name right, the actress. She was in Scientology and has had an ongoing series. If someone has the name of it, you can just put in the chat. I'm just not remembering, but if you Google her in Scientology, she is, you know, survivors of that organization have been so appreciative of her work. If I think of some others in the course of this, I'll. Oh yeah, thank you, thanks, Anne. Unorthodox was the name of the Hasidic program I told you about. Fascinating drama. And if I think of some other ones, I'll let you know.
Janet, the next question.
I'm sorry, Mark. This is a little older, but Breaking Amish is a reality show. It started. It's not really recent, you know, but you can still find it, Breaking Amish. But that doesn't really focus so much on abuse per se. You'll have to kind of look for it. Sorry. Oh, return to Amish. Okay, thank you.
Jan, next question. Is it possible for authoritarian religious communities to exist on both the religious, political, social left and the right?
Yes. I actually got familiar with a researcher who kind of wrote the book on authoritarianism. And I was so fascinated by it. I actually put a section devoted kind of to this researcher from Canada in the book, and he has noted through psychological tests that there are traits that authoritarians have. Now, when psychologists study and talk about authoritarians, they're actually talking about the followers. And you can have right-wing authoritarians and left-wing authoritarians. But they have similar traits. And some of the ones that I remember are they're very conventional and can be very aggressive. So, you know, when we've seen folks be violent for their ideologies, we're talking, you know, very authoritarian followers there. I think that it's more rare to see left wing because the psychological nature of a lot of more liberal folks, they tend just to kind of not do so well with structure. But it can certainly happen. And there were, um, I want to say kind of, hippie communities and so forth, where they had some serious problems with child sexual abuse, because they had their own kind of little insular thing going. It's just that their ideologies were. I mean, I would say that the David Berg cult was kind of was left wing. I mean, they were all about love, and they were trying to get away from those, those religious structures, and so in that sense, I would classify them as a left wing authoritarian group.
Jenna, we're quickly running out of time. If anybody else wants to hop on the chat and ask a question, that'd be great. I'll try to get you in. If not, I have one final, it's kind of a hypothetical for you, Janet. So let's say that the head of the United States Council of Catholic Bishops calls you on the phone one afternoon and says, Janet, I know you've done groundbreaking research in this area, and we want to make kids in the Catholic Church as safe as we can, right? So the question is, tell him about institutional or policy reforms that are going to do the best job of keeping Catholic kids safe.
Oh, how much time do I have? I will try to keep it brief, Mark, but that's one of the best questions I've ever been asked. It's like something I can fantasize about. Anyway, the first thing I would say is to acknowledge that religious leaders are human beings. They may be very wise. They may be very educated about canon law and all that great stuff, but they are human. They are human. And so if we can kind of get away from this idea that they're somehow superior in some way, it's, many Catholics do believe that priests are kind of biologically superior to everybody else. That's a dangerous ideology in my view. The second thing is to just spread the word through the organization that if you are aware or suspect that a child has been abused, that you report it to outside authorities. Pope Francis just said, this is so important to do. And don't stop at your bishop, don't stop at your priest to check in and make sure it's okay. Just do it. Trust those outside authorities. Do they get it right every time? No, but that's the system we have. And they are very well experienced and trained to handle cases like that. I could probably think of some other things too, but those are the two that come to mind like immediately. What do you think of those ideas, Mark?
Oh, well, I honestly, I think they're dynamite, and there's a degree to which, I remember when I was writing my PhD dissertation about 20 years ago, and I was doing research on a German moral theologian. He was talking about the role of Catholic bishops in the church. And I can't quote him exactly, but he would wax eloquently about bishops being a font of truth, being morally superior, being the repositories of wisdom for the church. And he firmly believed that God gave a bishop grace during episcopal ordination that really did make them superior in terms of their moral insight, right? And this is exactly the kind of mentality that you're talking about that leads to a lot of deferential behavior that eventually kind of seeps into this authoritarian faith culture that's so dastardly for kids, right? Your second point in terms of spreading.
Before you go on, though, I just want to say I love the idea of them striving to be morally superior. They should have more wisdom and knowledge about leading an ethical life because of their position. So that to me is a standard that they should be cognizant of.
Right.
as opposed to just sort of, you know, being handed this superiority just by the fact that they
Right.
wear the,
Yep. That,
you know,
that's fair.
color.
And I'm glad you mentioned Pope Francis. There are two things for the Catholic people who are listening tonight. One is called the Dallas Charter, which was adopted by the United States Council of Catholic Bishops back in 2002, which has a little bit of schizophrenia in it because it requires church employees to be mandatory reporters to the civil authorities or face termination of their employment in a Catholic institution, but it doesn't require that for priests and bishops, right? And Pope Francis, in his most recent document, which is essentially a 3-year experiment, still allows investigations of suspected child abuse to be done in-house by people that bishops appoint, right? So what's funny is, I think, so what's called the Dallas Charter has been remarkably successful, I think, of protecting our kids because it essentially takes the whole investigation process outside the confines of the Catholic Church and turns it over to detectives who are experienced at this stuff, right? And I'm not sure why, after 20 years, we haven't learned our lesson that this is actually a good thing. So now we're kind of, in a way, reverting back to the good old days of the church handling these investigations. So I'm glad you mentioned that. Honestly, I think in many ways, you need to find some external authorities who can be trusted to do the right thing most of the time and turn it over to them because they have the knowledge and in
And I
most
think,
cases, the resources to do those things.
well, I also think just having there be more communication and partnership with outside authorities. I saw that happen in an Amish community where a detective, I mean, it was kind of miraculous that this detective found out about this case, which was a father who was sexually abusing like all the daughters in the family. And after the father was convicted and he was put away for a long time, the detective stayed in touch with the elders and kept that communication going so that that trust was developed. I just want to make a quick comment, and I'm sorry I'm not remembering this exactly, but in my book I did address the kind of rule that you're talking about that has to do with reporting by, I don't know if it was the Dallas, but it was the U.S. Bishops Council that came up with some amazing policies and procedures. But as I recall, the Vatican opposed that one aspect of it, requiring that cases be reported.
Yes. Janet, we're out of time. I want to thank you for two things. Number one, for doing what you're doing to keep our kids safe. I want to thank you. Secondly, I think that a lot of people don't understand all the self-imposed isolation it takes to write a book. And you have to do that over long periods of time. You have to know your stuff. And you have to delve very deeply into a lot of details. So thank you for having the self-discipline to write your book. I'm hoping that everybody gets a copy and reads it. And I'm hoping that when that happens, that our kids will become safer in their respective religious communities. So thank you for all you do. And thanks for joining us here tonight, Janet. It was a pleasure having you.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate everybody being here, and take good care.
Good. Thanks, everyone. Take care. Be good.